Dr. Brian McNulty brings 30 years of experience as a nationally recognized educator in leadership development to his current position at the Leadership and Learning Center, where he serves as Vice President of Leadership Development. Brian formerly served as the Vice President for Field Services in the Mid-Continent Research for Education and Learning, McREL. Prior to working at McREL, he was Assistant Superintendent for Adams County School District 14 in Colorado and was Assistant Commissioner of Education for the Colorado Department of Education. Brian's work and writing have been featured in books, scholarly journals, and periodicals throughout the world. He's written more than 40 publications, including Leaders Make It Happen with Laura Besser and School Leadership That Works, From Research to Results, as well as the ASCD best-selling publication, which he co-authored with Robert Marzano and Tim Waters. Although Brian is well known as a researcher and keynote speaker, his primary work is focused on long-term intensive partnerships with schools, districts, state education agencies, and educational service agencies in applying current research to field-based problems. His current research has been focused on developing continuous improvement frameworks based on data and inquiry. I can tell you that we've been blessed at the state with Brian's assistance in a number of areas, and as a superintendent, I also had the pleasure of working with him and with our leadership team in our school district for many years. It is my personal and professional pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Brian McNulty.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to try and talk to you about formative assessment. I'm hoping that you know some about this already, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail myself. So let me just start off setting the course here, and this is what I'd like to talk about. These are sort of the learning outcomes. One is obviously, what do we mean by formative assessment? Everyone uses the term, we use it differently. I want to get some consensus amongst all of us around what are the ways to think about formative assessment. But really what I want to talk about is how do we increase learning in the application of that learning in the classroom, at the school level, and at the district level. And that, in order to do that, we have to talk about leadership. So everything really comes down to leadership on the part of the principal and the building leadership team, on the part of the district, superintendent, and district leadership team. So I'll talk about that a little bit later on. If you're thinking about formative assessment as sort of the latest and greatest thing, and it's going to be the one thing that's going to make the difference, I'm going to tell you, you need to rethink that. I'll show you some data that says formative assessment is hugely powerful, and it's certainly a piece of our work. But the real work here is how do we get teachers to collaboratively work together to examine their own work and the effectiveness of their own teaching. That's the work. Formative assessment is the tool that we use to do that. But really, the work that we have to do is to engage teachers in consistently examining the effectiveness of their own teaching. That's what is going to make the difference. So let's start here. What's the one skill that kids are going to learn in school that's not going to be obsolete? Okay, this is a 30-second discussion at your table. Go ahead. What's the one thing that's not going to be obsolete? If you're reading like I am, it's saying half of what they know is going to change while they're in school. So go ahead, have a quick discussion. What's not going to be obsolete? You got any guesses? What do you think? Take a risk. Go ahead. Come on, let's hear. Reading? Good guess. Problem solving? Good guess. Critical thinking? All of these are good. Learning. You got it. Learning how to learn, right? If you can't continue to learn, you're not going to make it at all, right? So we got rapidly happening in this country sort of really low-wage jobs that are repetitious, and middle-class jobs are going away unless you have the ability really to learn while you work and improve on your own work. So this idea of teaching kids how to learn and how they learn best is hugely important, and we want to empower them with that ability to learn as they move on out of K-12 and into higher ed or whatever their other work is going to be. So this was by Barber and Morshed. What they said was the quality of an education system can't exceed the quality of its teachers. Now, I like this quote because we get into a lot of problems when we start talking about the quality of teachers, about how we measure it and how well are the assessments, but that is not going to go away. They're going to get more sophisticated in our assessments, but the quality of teaching matters. I'll talk a little bit about John Hattie's work. I can't imagine you haven't heard this from lots of people now, but what we do know is the quality of teaching is what makes the difference. So let's start with some questions. These, I can't imagine you won't say yes to all of them, but you can answer that yourself. Here's the first question. Do you think teachers have to continually learn and then use more effective practices? Yeah? Everybody believes it. Everybody. But of course, it doesn't end there, does it? That's a part of the issue that we have is teachers need to be better learners, right? How about principals? Sure, as long as you're not a principal, you're all for principals learning and doing more, right? Principals will tell you, I think I read a recent study that said 75% of principals now believe that their jobs are completely unmanageable, right? And they are, if you look at what we're asking them to do. This is going to have to be a whole new set of discussions that are going to have to go on if we want principals to truly be instructional leaders, spend more time in classrooms, spend more time providing feedback to individual teachers and teams of teachers about their own work. So this is going to take more work at the central office, freeing up principals' times to do this exact work. So if that's true, how about the central office staff? Everybody think that they have to learn and apply new learning? You bet. That's why I said you all should say yes to all of these. Here's the reality. We're all really good at learning. We're not as good at applying that learning. So when I was here in Missouri earlier this year, I talked a lot about the lack of implementation, how poorly we implement when we do things. So we know them. We know what the right work is to do. We're just not very good at following through. So this is true, of course, for all of us individually also. We have to agree not only to learn more, but to apply that learning. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about formative assessment, but it doesn't mean anything unless you apply this. So I talked about John Hattie, so I thought I'd just start with this little sort of synopsis of his. The biggest effect on student learning occurs when teachers, become their own learners, right? So they are studying their own work, and they know whether what they're doing is more effective for more kids. And the second part is then empowering students to become their own learners. So I'm going to talk a little bit about assessment and the role that assessment plays in this, but getting kids to assess their own learning and take charge of their own learning is everything that Hattie is about, is how do we get kids to really own their own learning? And we hear all the time about how students are not engaged and they don't care and they don't participate. Well, it depends what you ask them to do, right? Because if they're actively engaged in meaningful tasks, guess what? They will participate, and they will willfully participate. So our business then is learning. You'd think this would be self-evident in education, right? That really what we're trying to do is to help people learn how to learn and to become better learners and to continuously learn on their own. So our fundamental role then is to constantly evaluate the impact that we have on kids. So John Hattie presents it this way, right? Know your impact. So I'll present this slide at least once more. But this is true for students, know whether what they're doing is making a difference or not, for teachers to know whether what they're doing is making a big enough difference on student learning, for principals to know whether teachers are engaged in teaching that is having a significant impact on the learning of students, and for district and central office staff to know whether kids in their schools and the leadership in those schools is resulting in greater learning. So you're all about to get your assessment results. You're going to find out one measure of that. That's one very crude measure, right? What we really need to be looking at is how do we know in an ongoing way? And that is formative assessment. But this is going to require more learning on everybody's part. It's not just about teachers doing more, it's about us all doing more. So I'm going to start with another question. How do schools get better? I got a very simple answer for you here, but how do schools get better? Regardless of what your performance level is now, how do you get better? Go ahead, have a short discussion, and we'll come back together. And I'll give you the answer that I'm looking for, at least. There's lots of ways. Okay, take about another 30 seconds. We'll come back together. Okay, I'll give you a little hint. I gave you the answer already, pretty much. So let's come back together. What do you think more powerful teaching practices matter? Sure, you bet. You should say yes, right? Right. More powerful teaching practices matter. How about more effective assessment practices? How about more powerful leadership? There's lots of things that make a difference, right? Here's where the research has gone, however. I'm going to unpack this, but I'll show you the answers first, right? Disciplined, professional, collaborative inquiry and learning. So let me just unpack this for a minute. By disciplined, what I mean is we have a knowledge base, okay? We hold ourselves to following through on the way we know how it needs to be done well, right? How many people here use some form of protocols? What's a protocol, right? It's just a written procedure, right? I'll tell you, you use protocols all the time. If you have teacher teams, how many of them use a written protocol, right? Steps in a process. Well, the answer should be every one of them, right? Now, I will tell you, I've used protocols with educators, and by and large, we're horrible at being disciplined. I used just last week a thing called the last word protocol, where one person reads something and then they present what they found. Everybody can ask a clarifying question, and then they wrap it up, and then you move on to the next person. I didn't find a single group that could follow that simple protocol. Why? We are so used to talking over each other, and because we believe that our answers are right, and we're going to push our thinking onto everyone else. First of all, I would just like to caution us that maybe there are other people who are equally as smart at the table with us, right? So trying to use even a simple protocol in education is hugely difficult. I'm telling you, with teacher teams, if you don't use a strict protocol, the process doesn't work. So this idea of introducing discipline into our processes matters, right? We are not very disciplined. How much time do we spend in undisciplined meetings? Most of us would say our whole life, right? It feels like, right? We could have much more effective meetings if we were a little more disciplined. But the first part here is we have to be disciplined in our professional collaborative work. But being a professional, what does that mean? Any guesses? Being a professional means, first of all, you have a knowledge base around what works, right? We know what works, and we apply what works. So I like to use the example of heart surgery. The heart surgeon, when they first started doing open heart surgery, now they're doing it with catheters, a lot of it, right? Which is much less invasive. But when they started to learn this, using catheters to operate on the heart, somebody figured it out, they codified it. And then they brought in another physician and co-conducted the operation. And they did this over and over again and spread this out and published the protocols until now that's the routine practice. So here's the question. You got to have bypass surgery, and two physicians come in and say, one of them says, I'm going to follow the protocol exactly. And the other says, I'm feeling sort of really creative today, and I think I'm just going to try and do it myself. Which one are you going to pick? I'm hoping you're going to pick the one who's going to follow the protocol, right? Now, if something goes wrong during the surgery, do you want them to use all of their knowledge and skills? Absolutely. That is what you're paying them for. But you're paying them to follow the protocol also. So when we talk about teaching and learning, we know some protocols, and we should have high expectations for follow-through on them. And this is not taking away anybody's creativity. This is saying we know some things that work best for kids in their learning. Now, I'm all for taking those practices and implementing them and getting people to examine them and see how well they work and to see if we could learn from that and how to make them stronger. So that's professionalism also. But the first part of being a professional is using the knowledge base that we already have. Okay, the last part is collaborative inquiry and learning. You're going to see, if you've been reading the research out there now, everybody is starting to say the same thing. This idea that we would bring teams of teachers together, teachers and their administrators together, teachers, administrators in the central office together to handle the issue of continuous improvement, everybody is saying the same thing. You don't change schools one teacher at a time or one principal at a time. You change the culture of the school by changing the way that people collaboratively work together. Now, not all collaboration is equal, right? No, disciplined professional collaboration is what we want. So it's not any form of collaboration, because we've studied collaboration too, and guess what? What we found is bringing teachers together to collaborate by itself gets you no better outcomes. Bringing teachers together in a structured way that supports their learning, right, that uses data, right, to help make decisions based in data does make a difference. So this idea of disciplined, professional, collaborative inquiry and learning and applying that learning is what most researchers are now saying is the key to making schools better. Now again, we could do this as poorly as we've done many things in the past, right? So every school I go into has some form of teacher teams, and when I ask to sit in on a team or look at what were the decisions the team made, what were they studying in terms of specific teaching practices, I get blank stares. So then I have to say, you're not following what is the protocol for good collaborative work. But everybody is saying the same thing. The only way to get large-scale improvement, be that school-wide or district-wide, is to invest in building the capacity of everybody in the school to examine their own work or their collective work. So that's what I'm going to talk about mostly. So the idea, everybody has said this. This is Fullen, this is 2014. I got 50 studies just like this, right? Say the same thing. Groups of teachers working together over periods of time in a structured way will produce greater learning in students. So principals, however, have to lead this work. I'm not going to present this data today, but Vivian Robinson did a large-scale study, took the study that we did on principal leadership, added new studies, found the single largest effect size for principals. It's a 0.84 effect size. So when you think about effect sizes, that's huge. That's about equal to over 2 years' worth of growth. The one thing that principals do that makes the difference, right? Leading teacher learning and development. Leading teacher learning. Think about this. So this is not about teaching teachers to do more and the principal being absent from that. This is the principal leading that learning. They are actively involved in those teams. They're actively in classrooms, observing and giving feedback. These are the things that matter. So principals have to lead that work. In order for principals to lead that work, the central office needs to support them in different ways. So I'm going to just show you this data because this is from Michael Fullen's latest work. 72 districts, large urban districts of well over 2.5 million kids, 1 million kids. So large urban districts, suburban districts, small districts, 4,900 schools, getting improvement across the whole province of Ontario. Improvements in literacy, high school graduation, and across the entire school system, but these are multiple school systems. So 10 years ago, we were studying what do we know about schools that get better. 5 years ago, we were studying what do we know about districts that get better. Now Fullen is looking at how do you actually change whole things like states, right? It's the same exact work, right? Develop the capacity of staff to do the shared work that they need to do, which is increase accountability, but with increased support. So increased transparency of results is what he said, and practices. Which practices give you which results? So I'm going to talk more about this, and this leads right into formative assessment. That's why I'm talking about this. And then maintaining a relentless focus on progress, that we got to keep moving ahead. So we know what to do at the school level, at the district level. We even need to know what to do at the state level or national level. So let's talk why formative assessment. Here's why. It started with Dylan Williams' paper that was a large meta-analytic study that they looked at, does formative assessment make a significant difference? His answer was, I can't find anything that makes more of a difference, right? This in itself, a reported effect size, again, of 0.7. Maybe the only thing that beats it is that principal leadership action I told you about, right? But this idea that formative assessment could increase student learning by this much. Now, again, if you don't remember your statistics, a 1.0 standard deviation, okay, is equal to about 2 to 3 years worth of growth. 2 to 3 years worth of student growth. So a 0.7 is a huge effect size. So here's the second one. Use of assessment to inform instruction, particularly at the classroom level, okay, effectively doubles student learning. That's that 0.7, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about what do we mean by that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So here's just another way of looking at the same data. Teachers who used formative assessment regularly, gaining feedback from their students, right, about the effectiveness of their teaching and learning, doubled the learning. So when we talk about kids who are far behind, when you start thinking about doubling their learning every year, this is a huge, important factor in that, is this idea that teachers and students are getting constant feedback about their progress. So here's part of the problem. The term formative assessment is used to describe everything now, right? Everything I see now is a formative assessment, right? So we see districts developing formative assessments, and we're going to use a formative assessment. And the formative assessment comes to be seen as the test, the instrument, right? That's a mistake. Formative assessment is not about the test or the instrument. Formative assessment is about the feedback to the teacher and the feedback to the student, right? So you can do all of the formative assessments you want, and if they're tests and they're used like usual test results, it's not going to make any difference. You're certainly not going to get that double performance difference by just developing formative assessments and hoping that people understand or gather that data, but don't do anything with that data. That's the problem. Districts have invested heavily now in developing shared formative assessments, but the question is, how is the data being used? So here's the first big idea, okay? Define the purpose of the assessment. Why do we do formative assessments, right? What's the purpose? The purpose is to gather evidence of where the student is, right? And then to make a decision, should I move on? Do I need to go deeper or in a different direction based on the feedback I just got from students? Now, classroom formative assessment is exactly that, right? So here's a question for you. You're doing Smarter Balance, right? I think you're doing a formative evaluation this fall. Is that true? That's what I heard. That's true, right? The question is, will it be used formatively? You have to answer that question, but what I'm going to say is, here's what the assessment, the assessment consortia really are trying to do what we've asked them to do. Help us get more and better data in an ongoing way so it's not a single event, right? So you've got the assessment developers working hard to develop more responsive assessment systems. But if you're going to participate in doing this fall, the question is, how are you going to use that data? How are teachers going to use that data? This is what we've been asking for. It's too late at the end of the year. What can we learn at the beginning of the year, right? To act on this. So you can use the same instrument both formatively and summatively, right? It all depends on how you use it, right? So they're more a description of the function, right? So I want you to think about this because I want you to start thinking about your own staff and the way they use the terminology of formative assessments. Because if teachers see the formative assessments that you're developing and using as another just test that is static, then they're not formative, they're summative, right? Here's where the kids are, okay, move on, right? As opposed to what can we learn about where the kids are now and what they do know and don't know, and what does that mean about our teaching? So here's the second big idea. Formative assessment is feedback to the teacher. Can you share it with the students? Sure you can. It's not secret, but it's really meant to be information for the teacher to use to say, where are kids right now? What's their depth of knowledge in this content right now? Now, what do I need to know more about in order to go deeper with the kids? So I'm going to talk about that when I talk about the classroom application of this. So here's the third big idea. The focus is on the decisions that you make as a result of that data and the actions that you take, right? This is, if a teacher gets formative assessment results back and doesn't change the way they teach, it's not a formative assessment, right? It's an assessment, but it's not formative. So this is all about what's the data give us, what does it mean, what decisions are we going to make as a result of that data, and what actions are we going to take. Now this is true for individual teachers, it's true of teacher teams, it's true of the building leadership team, and it's true of the district leadership team. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that also. So, you could require this, right? We could say, as a result of formative assessments, I want to see the changes that you made to the way you taught. That might be a little heavy-handed, but my point here is, if we're gathering assessment data and it's not changing our practice, then don't bother collecting the assessment data. So we've got to communicate to teachers more clearly that the purpose of assessment is feedback to you about how well kids are doing, and it's important for you then to think about how are you going to change the way you teach based on that data. So here's the last big idea. Formative data gives us better ability to make better decisions, right? Because we have evidence, right? So I'm not trying to pick on teachers here, but when we say, so when did you decide to move on then to the next topic? The answer usually is because in the curriculum map or in the curriculum, this was time to move on. Doesn't matter whether the kids were there or not, right? That can't be the way we make decisions, right? So I'm going to talk to you about some better ways that we can make those decisions. But let's talk about sort of the three levels here. So really, there are really three levels of formative assessment that we can think of, right? There's classroom formative assessment, common formative assessment, and then system formative assessment. So I'm going to try and talk about each one of these. So in the moment formative assessment, when a teacher is saying, how clear are you on this? Okay, give me a thumbs up if you're crystal clear. Give me a thumbs this way if you're pretty clear. Give me a thumbs down if you're not. Or is using a whiteboard and having kids write the answer and hold the answer up, right? That kind of formative assessment, if the teacher uses that information to adjust what they're doing, increases learning by around 70%. Now think about that. That's huge, right? It doesn't make any difference, however, if the teacher looks around the room, sees what students wrote, and doesn't change what they do. It doesn't make any difference then. It only makes a difference if the teacher changes the way they teach. But when they do that, and they stop, and they say, okay, it looks like a significant number of you are unclear about this. So let's spend a little more time going a little deeper into this. I'm going to actually give you a little quiz here in a minute, right? Then what the teacher can do is to give more descriptive feedback to individual kids or groups of kids based on the data they just collected. So the quality of the feedback to students goes up because it's based on what the teacher just saw. So that's the difference, right? It changes what the teacher does based on the feedback the students gave her, and then based on the feedback that he or she gave back to the student. Here's where you're unclear. Let's talk about that in a little more detail. When it improves the instructional decisions, that's the only way it makes a difference. So all of this then is about feedback, right? All of formative assessment is about feedback. And it's feedback in multiple directions, right? It's feedback from the student to the teacher. It's feedback from the teacher to the student. It's feedback from student to themselves. It's feedback from student to student. All of that is feedback, right? So after administering a formative assessment, the teacher can provide feedback in lots of ways. One of the things that you see really highly effective teachers doing is then doing some cooperative grouping of kids, right? Okay, let's see, compare your answers over there, and you guys compare your answers over here. Now discuss how you got to your answer, and then have them process the content from up here, right? And then ask them to report back out. Okay, now let's see your answers. What did you collaboratively agree on, right? This is feedback to the teacher, to the students, student to students, and then students to teacher, right? How long does that take? Minutes, not periods, minutes, right? We're not taking 50 minutes to do this. Is a 3-minute engagement or a 5-minute processing with kids. It doesn't take that long. So it only matters if you gather the information and use it. And then teachers, the students, and the peers can make decisions about the next steps. I'm going to talk, matter of fact, a little bit more about Hattie in just a minute. But we often hear about sort of assessment for learning. That's what this is. Real formative assessment is assessment for learning. It is, here's where I am now. Now I'm clear about where I am. What do I need to do next? Then that's the time to get appropriate feedback, right? So as we've looked at this, if you took all the research on feedback, okay, feedback should cause thinking. I wasn't clear about this. Now I'm a little clearer about it. I'm clear about what my next step is. And then the question is, what do I need to do? What do I need to do? So if you only walk away with one thing today, walk away with this. The purpose of assessment is to inform instruction, right? And look at where kids are and then make a decision based on what information you just got back from kids as to where the kids are in their own learning. If you go into classrooms and see teachers who are really good at formative assessment, you see them checking in with students all the time. Collectively, individually, in small groups, they're always taking sort of the heartbeat of where kids are in their own learning and the depth of their learning. So look at this. I've talked about Hattie a little bit already, but look at this. He cites this, okay, the teacher's willingness, and I love this terminology, to seek disconfirming evidence, right, as the most crucial part in student learning. And he's always saying about checking for surface learning and deep learning. So teachers who are able to check and see, okay, people aren't clear on this particular concept, right? I got to go a little bit deeper here. Teachers who are willing to take the risk to gather that kind of disconfirming information are the most effective teachers. Why? Because they change what they do. So here's a question for you. So you've seen the data from other countries, the high-performing countries, right? So here's the question. Do teachers in the United States talk more or less than other countries, particularly the highest-performing countries? Go ahead, this is a short discussion, and I'll wait to hear your answer. Shouldn't take long. Sure, that's fine. Sure. This is not a trick question. Okay, what do you think? Let's see. Hold up your hands. How many people think American teachers talk more than other countries? How many of you think they talk less? Here's the results. Surprisingly, right? Here's the answer, the real answer. It's how the teachers talk to their students. So if you've read about teaching mathematics, teachers in other countries, first of all, do less numbers of problems, but they go deeper into the problem solving, right? And what do? Teacher talk. So just like we do with like guided reading, that they're unpacking. So I wonder what would happen if I did this. Let's see. Nope. Okay. Now, if I did this, I wonder what would happen. Teachers in other countries actually talk more, but they're much more descriptive about the learning. So I thought this was interesting because what you see is they assess more, but what they gather then is where kids are struggling, and they will literally unpack that based on the feedback they've gotten from students. So they actually talk more, but it's how they talk. So it's not the quantity, right? It's the quality, right? So I'm not going to go home and tell you to go home and tell your teachers to talk more, because honestly, there's too much lecturing, right? But what I am going to tell you is, when we think about formative assessment and gathering feedback from students, what really highly effective teachers do is they then model the learning for students. So they'll pick up on where kids are struggling, and they'll put that up, and they'll walk through the steps of how can I think about this to get to the answer. And there are probably 2 or 3 ways that I could do that. So let me try that, right? So I just put that up there because I thought it was a little interesting, but it was particularly interesting what they did in terms of getting feedback from students. And that was model more, right? So the goal here is really then to get students to self-assess and get students to help move their own work forward. How many of you have seen this publication, Missouri Collaborative Work? There are about 325 schools, I guess, in the state who are doing this work. There's a big piece in here on feedback. There's a lot, however, on what John Hattie would call assessment-capable learners. So I'm going to just show you this because it fits right into what we're trying to talk about. So here, this is the single largest effect size that Hattie has reported, a 1.44 effect size. It's like unheard of. So it's made up of 2 things, but the question I want to ask you is, what is it really? Self-reported grades and student expectations. So here's the question I want to ask you. What is an assessment-capable learner? Why does it have such a large effect size? And what would you look for if you were going to go into a classroom and look for an assessment-capable learner? Take a minute. What is it? Okay? What is an assessment-capable learner, and why is the effect size so high? I'll show you this slide again just so you have it. Go ahead, you can talk. Don't be afraid. I'm not going to ask you to report out, so I'm not going to embarrass anybody. Just see if you can decide what is an assessment-capable learner and why does it have such a high effect size. Okay, take one more minute. Okay, 15 seconds. Okay, let's come back together. So I can't imagine that many of you haven't read Hetty's work, so this shouldn't be a big surprise to you. But I want to unpack this just a little bit because I want to then link this back to formative assessment, right? What is an assessment-capable learner? And what he says is it's really four things, right? So you'd almost call this a meta strategy. But if you think about it, some of this we've been talking about for a very long time. The first thing is the student knows what the learning outcomes are, right? How long have we been talking, about what the learning outcomes are, right? And the kids are clear about what the learning outcomes are. Since I've been in education, right? This is not news. Now, is posting them on the board provide enough clarity for students to know what the learning outcomes are? Probably not, but it's a first step, right? It should at least be posted, right? So at a minimal level, we would know what the learning outcomes are. The second thing that the student would know is, where am I in relation to the learning outcomes? So you then have to understand that there are certain criteria associated with the learning outcome, and I'm at step 2 out of 4 steps, right? So I've still got 2 more steps that I need to follow through on. So when we've defined the criteria, and kids can self-assess against the criteria and hold themselves accountable to where they are, right? So I know where I'm going, I know where I am, right? The next piece is, I know what the right next step is. So I'm clear about what I need to do to move ahead. So if I've completed 2 of the 4 steps, I know what step 3 is and what I need to do. The fourth one is honestly the most difficult one. And the fourth one is that the student feels comfortable enough to ask for help when they don't know what to do, right? So think about this. This has everything to do with the degree of psychological safety in the classroom, with raising your hand with not necessarily the right answer. This is my best guess at my level of understanding, right? But students can ask for help. So if a student can do those 4 things, by and large, he is what Hattie would call an assessment-capable learner. They're self-motivated because they know where they're going, they know where they are, they know what they need to do to get there. So this idea of empowering students to take control of their own learning matters. So this means there needs to be a climate where there's minimal reactivity to having the wrong answer, right? Now, that's not the right answer. However, let's see, who else is willing to jump in, right? And the second thing, there's low public risk. So I find this to be hugely interesting because I was just reading an article about how in education we are so risk averse across the board, right? That the idea of taking risks is hugely challenging for us as individuals and as a system. That we're not very comfortable taking risks. So here we are trying to get our students to take more risks in classrooms and to get our teachers to take more risks with the students to try and gain more information back, because the teacher needs to know where they are. And if the teacher isn't clear about where they are, then we have a problem. So this is all, how many of you people remember Piaget? Right? So if you looked at Hattie's work, the second highest effect size is actually for Piagetian sort of approach to teaching, right? So I'm not going to go into that, but he and Vygotsky really built on this, the idea of the zone of proximal development. The idea here is to give feedback to kids that's right sort of in time and is just a little bit above where they are, pushing their thinking all the time. So this is the purpose, again, of formative assessment, is knowing right when and where kids are so that you can give the right and kind of feedback. All feedback is not valuable, right? Feedback that's too far above your level doesn't help you at all. What was the point, okay, on a paper? Doesn't really give a lot of feedback to kids, right? Okay, so let me jump ahead. I said there were 3 different levels here, so I want to talk about common formative assessment. So this is the work that we see going on in teacher teams, and this is the most important part, along with the teaching strategies that needs to be a part of your teacher teams, right? So common formative assessments are, we're going to look at what are we going to teach to, how are we going to assess it, right? And then how are we going to teach it, right? So being clear about the learning outcomes first, and then looking at how will we assess it, and then how will we teach it. Those are the most critical parts of teacher teams, right? So the first part, though, is you got to define the purpose, right, of the common formative assessment. So we got to clear with people, first of all, we're not trying to do this work around everything. This is where teacher teams go astray, or they're not focused enough. The work of teacher teams is based on priority standards. What's the most important learning that we could all agree on, that we could teach to, because it's important enough to all of us to participate in this team to do this work. So this would be linked then to the Missouri Learning Standards. We've started talking about this, and you don't need to do it this way, but in terms of rigorous curriculum design, right? Where now that we have the Missouri Learning Standards, not all standards still are created equal, right? Some are more important than others. Some are what we would call substandards of others, right? So getting sort of teachers to unpack the Missouri Learning Standards like we did before, right? Identifying those priority standards, unwrapping them to understand what do we need to know and be able to do, right? What are the big ideas and essential questions? And again, and then writing your assessment questions, right? Selected response or constructed response, right? So my point here is not, I don't want us to get too hung up on that particular process, but what I do want to do is to understand we want teachers to work from a rigorous curriculum with engaging teaching, but then collaborative, formative assessments that they would develop in their teams. So a part of the learning that goes on in those teacher teams is, first of all, agreeing on what do we think the most important learning outcomes are that we need to teach to collectively, right? These are the most important learning outcomes. Let's pick 1, 2, 5, depending upon how many times we meet. Optimally, obviously, we would be meeting every week, right? So then, common formative assessments are just the assessments that we get teachers to develop in these teacher teams that are aligned to the Missouri Learning Standards, right? And we're developing units, and then we're unpacking those units down to the lesson level. So here's when assessment informs instruction. When teachers collaboratively score the assessments, we learned this a long time ago, but when we get teachers to collaboratively score, what they start to realize is, guess what? We don't all grade the same way, I know this is shocking news to most of you, but grading is all over the place, right? So getting teachers to agree on what the important learning outcomes are and how the kids would demonstrate that, and then how would we assess that, really helps teachers to understand, oh, we didn't, guess what? It wasn't the kids didn't know it. We didn't ask it in a very good way. It was a very confusing question, right? To analyze the results, right? So they're using those common formative assessments to say, this is where kids are, right? And then talking about what's the most powerful way to teach this. So the formative assessments form the foundation of where we start, and then we move towards how do we teach it and how do we assess it. So we talk about these as data teams. A lot of people talk about them as professional learning communities, but really this is the idea that data teams or professional learning communities and common formative assessments are at the heart of this process. And that when teachers then start assessing and seeing how well kids do or do not, and decide what does that tell us about our teaching, if we can get teams to get that far where they're assessing their teaching, collectively, the light goes on in terms of, you mean that the reason kids get it or don't is the way we teach it, right? The specific ways we teach make a difference. And this is when all of a sudden all of the learning around powerful teaching practices comes to bear. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about teacher teams. Again, people talk about them in different ways, sort of. But what we do know is, when I started with that slide around collaborative inquiry and learning, teacher-based teams have more data on them now than anything else that we've studied. So we do know that at every single level, teacher teams, when done well, results in better outcomes for kids in high-performing schools, in low-performing schools, in moderately performing schools. So these teacher teams that are using formative assessments and examining their teaching practices in an ongoing way make better progress. Now, again, I told you I stop into teams all the time, and what I see is they're not following the process, right? So here's the data. Collaborative schools do better than individualistic schools, and teachers who work in professional cultures of collaboration perform better, right? I use this slide all the time. This was a study by Gallimore and Saunders. It was a nice study because it was rigorously controlled for, control in experimental schools. We never do this. They were randomly assigned. Some schools got teacher team training. Some schools got training in other things, right? They studied them for the whole first year, no progress. They were disheartened, as you might imagine. They went in, this gets back to the disciplined piece, they went in and the teachers were not following all the steps of the protocol, right? They retrained teachers into following every step of the protocol, using a formative assessment, specific teaching practices, right, as a part of that work, right? When they did that and the teachers followed the protocol, the lowest performing schools in the district became the highest performing schools. So this is a wonderful study because you've got a comparison within and across districts as to low performing schools becoming high performing schools. How long did it take? 1 year. 1 year. So when people say to me, how long does it take to make progress? I say not longer than a school year. So getting these teams to use formative assessments in a way that examines teaching practices is what makes the difference. You can have teacher teams and they can make no difference. As a matter of fact, most of the teams that I see, they're not. So I try to say to people, the purpose of the teams is to increase performance, right? It's not to like each other more. It is about collaboration, but it's not about developing better relationships unless you mean better professional relationships, which is we hold each other accountable to follow through more, right? If that's the case, then it matters. So I like this definition from Trowan and Bowles, right? Leadership impaired teams are teams that are unable to hold each other accountable. This is all about creating collective accountability or shared accountability where teachers hold each other responsible to follow through. I will tell you, no amount of external pressure is enough to make teachers teach differently. If so, we'd be there already, right? We've tried every sort of external pressure possible, and it hasn't resulted in that much. The only thing that causes teachers to change their practice is accountability to their peers, where they commit to following through with their teachers on their own team, and they are held accountable if they don't follow through by their own peers. Now, this is internal accountability, and this is what we want to develop. So here's the data on teams. Only 1 in 10 teacher teams is effective. 1 in 10. Now, that's abhorrent. So everybody's got them, but they're not very good. Okay, let me skip ahead here. I want to talk just a little bit about systems formative assessment, because we haven't thought about this very much, not as much at least. So here's a way to think about it. In addition to teacher teams, you need to strengthen your building leadership teams, and you need to strengthen your district leadership teams. And what I say is the purpose of the teams is very clear. The building leadership team and the district leadership team, the purpose is to improve instructional practice and performance, the quality of instruction and the outcomes that we're getting. Those building leadership teams are monitoring and providing feedback to the teacher teams around how well are they doing, what's the quality of their formative assessments, what's their focus on instructional practices, really pushing those teams to go better. Now, these teams are collecting formative data, right? You can use a rubric. We have them. We can give them to you free, a rubric to go in and monitor your teacher teams and give them feedback, right? I want everybody on the building leadership team going into different teacher teams, evaluating where they are and giving them feedback, right? I want the teams self-evaluating where they are. That is formative data that you can act on. If you find teams are struggling on step 2 of the process, give them more help, right? If you find that they're struggling on addressing which specific teaching practices are we going to use, give them some more support. You can give them a cheat sheet. It's fine. Here are 10 powerful instructional practices. Choose from that. Then go in, teach it, assess it, come back and see how well you did. Now, I'm telling you, those teams should also have minutes of their decisions that they made and the follow-up. The building leadership team should be collecting those minutes. Is that formative assessment data? Sure it is. You bet. It shows you what the team's committed to do and follow through on and when, right? You can follow up on that. Now, I'm not saying this monitoring has gotten a very bad name of sort of punitive monitoring. This is meant to be supportive monitoring, if knowing where people are so you can help them move forward. I'm telling you, the district leadership team should be doing the exact same thing. Should be looking at where their teacher teams are. They should be looking with their principals at the quality of instruction in classrooms. You can collect data on that, right? So they should all be collecting data, right? Their own forms of data. So I say you look at 2 things here for your building leadership team and your district leadership team. This is your formative data. Student learning progress. How are students progressing? When you've got benchmark data that you can look at every 6 weeks, you can look at student learning progress. The question I'm going to ask the building leadership team is, what have we done for the kids who are not making progress? Do something, right? So I was working with a school last year that had an intervention that they developed for an hour every day for every kid in the building based on their own individual assessment of what they needed. Some kids who are already proficient went deeper into the content, right? For students who were close to proficient, they worked on specific splinter skills to give the kids what they needed to just become proficient. For the kids who are far from proficient, they increased the intensity of services to those kids. That school made like 50 percentage points in like 1 year. But they collected data on student progress every 6 weeks. And every 6 weeks they changed it. The model we have now is put a kid in a program, right? Nobody thinks that works, right? So putting a kid in a program for a year that we don't bother to assess whether it works or not is worse than nothing, right? You do better to let the kid sit. But I will tell you, if we look at assessing where kids are every 6 weeks and having the building leadership team say, we're going to intervene with kids who are not making progress, and then the next 6 weeks looking at the data and say, did it work or not? And then over time, what they do is accumulate a number of different interventions that they find work for their kids. It's not like one thing is going to be the answer. It's multiple things, but we've got to be willing to hold ourselves accountable at the school level and the district level also. That means looking at student data in a really sort of focused way. And then the second thing is going to be staff learning progress. If we're asking staff to follow through on certain practices, like formative assessment in the classroom, how much are we following up and seeing whether they're doing it? What's our data, right? So we can monitor teacher teams, we can monitor classroom practices, we can collect data on that, but then if we don't act on it, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing as formative assessment. If it just goes to the teacher and then the teacher doesn't change what they're doing, it doesn't matter. So getting building leadership teams and district leadership teams to really assess where they are is what will make the difference also. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. So I'm going to just ask you, okay, I'm going to give you just a 2-minute discussion. How much are your building leadership teams and district leadership teams looking at student learning progress and looking at staff learning progress? I don't think this is going to take too long, so just take a minute or two. Okay, take one more minute. Okay, let's come back together. Let me just ask you, how supportive do you think your teachers would be if you said to them, or their principals and their building leadership team said to them, we're concerned about the progress of some students and some subgroups of students, and we're going to try and more effectively meet the needs of all those students? You think you'd get a positive response? I can guarantee you will, right? Teachers are concerned when they're not making progress with certain students also, right? So we push that learning of students that are not making progress, first of all, into our teacher teams, but it also becomes a function of the building leadership team saying, we're going to take some action, we're going to see what works here for our kids. So I did all this to preface by saying we really need to start thinking about this work differently. So no matter what, even if we look at the most highly disadvantaged schools, that they can make continuous progress and sustain that progress. And I showed you this slide to begin with. But the only way to do that is not one teacher at a time, right? This idea that we're going to, and I know this is going to be controversial. I'm just going to say it because I'm here. Individually evaluating teachers is not going to get us there, right? Do we need to increase the quality of our teacher evaluation systems? Absolutely. Do we need to increase the quality of our principal evaluation systems? Absolutely. If that consumes all the time, however, of the principal as opposed to the principal leading instruction, we have a problem, right? So, because, well, I'm just trying to speak the truth here. I understand why we're all being asked to do this, because I'm in a lot of states. I just don't think that we're going to get highly effective schools one teacher at a time. That's not the way it happens. We've studied this deeply. And what it is it's a result, first of all, of the leadership of the principal, and then the work that the principal does with their building leadership team. So, effective teaching, is about powerful collective responsibility. Getting teacher teams to hold each other, every person in the team, accountable to following through on examining the effectiveness of the teaching practices they're using is what causes really robust change in schools, right? So we found no other way of changing whole schools except through powerful teacher teams. It hasn't been through evaluation. So professional development really doesn't work when it relies on individual teachers either, right? Plus, we don't do a very good job at follow-through. It only is effective, again, when we put it into the teams and hold the teams accountable to follow through. So I've said for a long time, collective action equals effective outcomes. Now, having said that, I do want to say all the successful systems value their teachers. You know, we're not going to fire our way to excellence. I just don't think that's what's going to get us there. I think we're going to get there by holding teachers and ourselves accountable to better outcomes and examining whether the practices we're using as administrators and as teachers are the most effective practices. Okay, let me just wrap this up. I always like to say this, that leadership is always a balance of both pressure and support. Nobody changes unless there's some pressure behind you. So it is important to push, right? However, unless you give people the support, people dig in their heels and they won't make change. So it's always a balance of pressure and support. And then lastly, it's always a question of whether we've implemented well and deeply enough. And usually the answer is we haven't. Okay, it's 2:15. I want to thank you for letting me spend this afternoon with you. I hope some of this information will be helpful for you as you go back to your districts. Thank you.